work on Disney. Yeah, history of capitalism.
Like, if we're doing a lot of stuff, being able to
Right. Nation. That's Japanese, right? Nation. Oh, you guys are I know, particularly being in Japan, come back to the United States, program your body differently in Japan. I don't feel that way in China. The Chinese are much more easygoing in terms of imposing social controls, behavioral controls. You have first rate, all that. All that.
Next time you're back in, come back to New York, let me know. You think it's 8 later in It means a lot.
Okay, the people in the back there are enjoying your chat. Please take your seats. My name is Bill Holstein. I'm your host for the evening, past president of the Overseas Press Club, which is sponsoring this event, along with ChinaFile from Asia Society and Strategy Risks. Isaac Stone Fish is here. So first, in the housekeeping department, making appeals. This is Mike Chinoy's book. It's in the back. It's available for sale. We wish to thank the folks from Columbia University Press for being here with it, and we wish to have many books sold tonight. I've already purchased mine. Second appeal is the caliber of the event we're about to witness is quite high. And judging from the people in the room, you all know who you are. This is the real deal. There are very few other organizations that can produce this kind of conversation. So I would appeal to you, journalists and fellow travelers, to join the Overseas Press Club. It's on the bottom of the fact sheet. The URL is on the bottom of the fact sheet on the welcome desk back there. So Now on to our presentation. Mike, we're right here. I first met Mike when I transferred to Hong Kong with United Press International in 1979. Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter had just normalized relations. It's incredible to think that was 44 years ago. We were only 12 at the time. We had a number of dinners, and it immediately became clear that Mike was much further down the China learning curve than I was. I rotated to Beijing for UPI as bureau chief and was home within about 3 years. But Mike stayed off and on in China and Hong Kong for how many years altogether? 20?
25 at this time.
Right. So very few American journalists, to my knowledge, have made that level of a commitment to covering China. So Mike's presentation will last about 20 minutes. Then we'll have a short surprise presentation, and then we'll have what I promise to be a robust discussion. Mike. You need to get the lights down at all?
While we wait for them to fiddle with the lights, let me just say how absolutely thrilled I am to be here and to see so many old friends and folks who know probably a lot more about China than I do. But it's great to have you here, and I really appreciate it. And to have somebody who used to work for UPI introduce me is especially meaningful because when I was in Beijing, opened the CNN Beijing bureau, we had a kind of, back then it was still known as sort of chicken noodle news. It wasn't the global colossus that it is today. And so CNN and UPI had a kind of alliance. We were the sort of underdog news agencies, and we essentially operated as kind of one bureau, especially during 1989. So I have a real soft spot for UPI, so it's especially gratifying that Bill is here. I want to just talk a little bit about some of the themes in the book, and then we can open it up for questions and discussion. And I want to begin by going back quite a long time to 1973, when I made my first trip to China, just 1 year after Richard Nixon's historic trip. That's me with the long, not gray hair and now. I went with a student group, and one of the places we were taken was the Wusan People's Commune near Shenyang. And there we met a model Maoist peasant named Yu Ke-xin. And we had lunch at his modest home, and it was, in many ways, the highlight of my month-long trip. 20 years later, in 1993, as CNN's first Beijing bureau chief, I decided to retrace the 1973 trip to see how the country had changed in the intervening 20 years. I managed to find Yu Ke-xin and track him down, and I discovered that he was now running a tractor repair shop. He lived in a new flat, he had a television set. He was clearly one of the beneficiaries of the market-oriented reforms that Deng Xiaoping had introduced some years before, and his life had clearly improved. But as soon as the local officials who'd arranged this were out of earshot, Yu confessed to me that almost everything I'd seen in that 1973 trip had been an illusion. He said, in fact, conditions back then were terrible, that he was lucky if he ate meat once a month, and that the meal I had so enjoyed had actually been trucked in by local officials the day before to impress the foreigners. So for me, this episode underscores the central theme in any discussion about the history and experiences of foreign correspondents in China. And that is the challenge of finding the truth in a vast, complicated country with a long history of distrust of outsiders and an authoritarian political system. Over the decades, reporters for the American media, in this case, the picture here is of John Pomfret, then in the AP and later the Washington Post. John's here with Wu Kai-si and Wang Dan, two student leaders in Tiananmen Square in 1989. But in any case, the reporters for the American media have played a critical role both influencing American views of the country as well as the policies of successive American governments. Moreover, because of the reach of U.S. news organizations like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, the networks, the wire services, such coverage has had a disparate kind of a large impact beyond the States, around the world. But for many consumers of news, the way they the information they read in newspapers or magazines or online or listen to on the radio or watch on television actually gets there remains a mystery. Few people understand what goes into the reporting, the writing, and the transmission of news. Yet, as I'm sure most of the journalists or former journalists in this room will acknowledge, the process decisively shapes virtually any news report. And so now, with China emerging as a global superpower and its relations with the U.S. more strained than at any time in the last 50 years, understanding the people who've covered China for the American media and how they've done so is a critical step to understanding the news that people are watching and reading. And providing that understanding is the central goal of Assignment China. The story of the journalists in Assignment China begins with the triumph of Mao Zedong's Communist Revolution in 1949, at which point virtually all American and other Western reporters were forced to leave the country. Indeed, when Mao proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic in Tiananmen Square on October 1st, 1949, not a single American correspondent was there to cover the event. For most of the 3 decades that followed, American reporters had little choice but to cover China from outside the mainland, most notably from the then British colony of Hong Kong. The China Watchers, as they became known, relied primarily on the official Chinese media, which they monitored religiously for clues. Bernard Cal, who sadly passed away recently at the age of 100, was based in Hong Kong for the New York Times and CBS News in the late 50s and early 60s. So we interrupt this program to get the ice cubes under control. Can you get the slide there?
How do we get information about China?
Hold on.
Maybe adjust the projector so we see more than the top.
It's moved.
So it's called technical glitch. I got very used to that at CNN.
Moment.
Is that Cal?
That's Bernard Cal's chin.
Okay.
Almost
Try
there.
this again.
We tested all this beforehand, and of course it worked perfectly, but now that we're doing it, it's not functioning. Do you want to just go on to the next one and see whether the
sound alone. Just let it roll. You can hear the sound.
all right, can you hear just play it, you can hear what he says, even if you can't see it.
Okay. I'm sorry, that slide is broken.
All right, we'll go to the next one then. Sorry, Bernie.
How do we get information about
well,
China?
there's a
We
sound.
got bits and pieces. We read everything we could. We put the mosaic pieces together and try to extract some narrative about what was happening in China. But this was bits and pieces journalism.
Okay, we'll go on to the next one. Hopefully the other clips will work better. It wasn't until Nixon's arrival in Beijing in February of 1972 that the door began to open. At that time, China had been cut off for so long that many journalists, even such network heavyweights as Dan Rather of CBS, felt like it was going into outer space. Looks like it didn't play.
It was a little bit the feeling we're leaving Earth and going deep into the cosmos of some distant planet.
When I interviewed Barbara Walters about that trip, she said that she felt like she was going to the moon, so that was a very common sensation at the time. And it wasn't really until the
It was
U.S.
a little bit the feeling we're leaving Earth.
It wasn't until the U.S. and China established formal diplomatic relations in 1979 that American news organizations were allowed to open bureaus in Beijing. That's when Bill went there. The interest in China was enormous. When Deng Xiaoping visited the US, the images of him wearing a cowboy hat at a rodeo in Texas cemented this idea of Deng as like the cuddly communist, and China as an attractive strategic and economic partner for the US. And the economic reforms that Deng initiated heightened this perception, which was fueled by the cascade of stories the newly arrived American journalists did about the changes underway. Jim Laurie opened the ABC News Bureau, and hopefully this will work.
If you go back and you look at the programming on ABC and NBC and CBS in 1979, that is very much reflected. China opening up. Every little innovation that occurred in the late 70s that were part of the reform program that Deng was outlining were seized upon. The first private restaurant, the first private car, the first of this, the first. It was all a series of firsts.
What followed was several decades.
Go back.
There were several decades when the People's Republic became increasingly accessible to American and other foreign journalists, although there were always obstacles and limitations. When I became CNN's first Beijing bureau chief in 1987, for example, the official regulations required reporters to get permission 10 days in advance for any travel outside Beijing, such as this trip I took with my crew to Tibet. Plus, reporters had to be accompanied everywhere by government minders. Moreover, contact with ordinary Chinese remained difficult. Still, Deng persisted with the reforms, which included greater engagement with the Western press. In 1986, for example, he gave an interview to Mike Wallace of CBS News 60 Minutes. It was the first time a Chinese leader had done an on-camera interview with foreign television. But the reforming trends alarmed party officials who made repeated attempts to roll them back by periodically launching campaigns against so-called bourgeois liberalization. Dorinda Elliott, who arrived in 1986 for Newsweek, tells a story about trying to interview a farmer in the countryside about one such campaign, an experience which I think gives a good sense of the challenges journalists face then.
That's what she said.
Yeah, she was such a silent there. Can you get the next slide?
I can go to the next slide.
There we go. You stay quiet.
Is that audio?
Yep, that's all.
And as a journalist, this was firstly no easy thing. You had to go through the Foreign Affairs Office of the province, and then it got down to the town level, whatever. By the time I got to the village, I probably had 20 Chinese officials, Communist Party officials following me. And I remember going into this farmer's house, and I'm trying to have a conversation with this farmer in Chinese. But in the meantime, like 15 or 20 government officials come into this tiny little house with me, and the entire village is basically looking through the window. The family of farmers are totally terrified, have no idea what's going on. So I turn to this woman, and I say, so tell me, what do you think about the bourgeois liberalization campaign and what's going on? And she says, she looks absolutely terrified, doesn't know what to say, and she says, well, the reason that we're supposed to support bourgeois liberalization is because, and you could see the officials saying, no, you're supposed to be opposing bourgeois liberalization. And, I felt like, oh my God, what have I done to this poor farmer?
I think you have to do 2 clicks to get so the sound doesn't repeat itself, right? The protests and crackdown in Tiananmen Square and elsewhere in 1989 made that year a watershed, not only for China, but in the history of media coverage of China. It was due to an accident of history, the visit by Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. The Chinese authorities wanted extensive coverage, and so they gave permission to CNN and other broadcasters to bring in satellite dishes and other transmission equipment. But then the students literally stole the stage on which the Sino-Soviet summit was supposed to take place. The live broadcasts, and today when it's possible to transmit video live from almost anywhere by an iPhone, it's easy to lose sight of just how unprecedented such coverage was, captured attention around the world. And it presented a picture of China utterly different from the narrative the Chinese Communist Party had sought to impose on foreign journalists. But on the night of June 3rd and 4th, as you all know, the army was called in to crush the protests. The following day, from the balcony of the Beijing hotel, the cameraman for CNN, Jonathan Scher, and a photographer for the AP, Jeff Widener, captured a moment that has become one of the iconic images of our time.
Another cameraman said, "Hey, look at that guy in front of the tank." And I looked at it and said, "Oh my God," zoomed in on it and started videotaping it. And they were trying to scare him off by shooting over his head. Well, shooting over his head was basically at where our position was. It was the 5th floor, 4th floor, whatever balcony we were on, but the bullets were so close you could hear them whizzing by. And at that point, we just locked the camera down. It was just too dangerous. There were bullets ricocheting around.
So I'm just like waiting for them to get shot and holding the focus on it, waiting and waiting, and it's too far away, and this is too far away, it's too far away. And I look back at the bed, and I had that lens doubler, which would make my 400 and 800, and I think, do I gamble? Do I go back to the bed? Maybe I lose the shot, or do I just shoot this wider? So I took a chance, and I ran to the bed, got it, put it on the camera, opened the aperture up all the way. 1, 2, 3 shots.
The images of the man in front of the tank
said, "Hey, look at that guy in front of the tank."
The tank man images became a symbol of the crackdown, and the coverage from Tiananmen produced a sea change in American perceptions of China. So much so that many reporters did not initially pay enough attention when Deng Xiaoping, in 1992, with his famous Southern tour, began to revive his program of economic reform. But American journalists swiftly shifted to chronicling the dramatic economic, social, and even political changes triggered by the boom. The new atmosphere also led to a significant improvement in working conditions. It became much easier to travel, and local officials were much more accessible. Instead of chasing them away, they often asked American correspondents for advice on how to attract foreign investment. By the late 1990s, the China beat was entering what Keith Richburg of the Washington Post described as its golden age.
This is some amazing transformation that's going on in China right now. Beijing was kind of really exploding as it went from being this kind of a difficult place for correspondents to live to being actually kind of fun.
It was, in fact, an exhilarating period because China's economy was turning into the manufacturing hub for the world, and American journalists, as other foreign journalists as well, were able to dig into Chinese society in ways that had previously been difficult, if not impossible, trying to make sense of the paradoxes of a country where one day you'd be covering a jailed dissident, and the next day you'd be covering the opening of the world's largest airport. 2008 was the climax of this period when Beijing hosted the Summer Olympics. In the run-up, the government lifted many long-standing restrictions on the movements and activities of foreign correspondents. But in the wake of the Games, China's domestic political climate and its external behavior began to change. The financial crisis that rocked the West in 2008 and 2009 convinced China's leaders that the U.S. was a declining power and that the time was right for Beijing to show a more assertive face to the rest of the world, and that included its treatment of the foreign media. For reporters, covering China became an increasingly tense game of cat and mouse with the authorities, a dynamic which became steadily nastier as Xi Jinping became increasingly powerful and began to roll back some of the reform policies of previous years, as well as making himself, in effect, emperor for life. Yet American correspondents managed nonetheless to do some remarkable work. This included the expose by Mike Forsyth of Bloomberg News about the hidden wealth of Xi Jinping's relatives, and David Barbosa's Pulitzer Prize-winning reporting about the hidden wealth of the relatives of Premier Wen Jiabao. It's interesting to hear Barbosa talk about how he reported the story.
Every time we requested a company, we found 10 more. So if you can imagine this big chart is you have, like even with Ping An, behind Ping An are 30 companies, and then behind those, it ends up, any company you look at is like 100 companies. I continued to map out a strategy of how to do it without setting off alarm bells, without letting people know, thinking about who was going to be translating, what I could show people, and also to go around to lawyers, accountants, bankers, and test some of the theories without giving them what I was doing, because that was too sensitive.
Of course, there's also been the terrific work of many journalists to expose the campaign of repression against the Muslim Uyghur population in Xinjiang, which helped make the Xinjiang situation into a major international issue. But one consequence of the tightening under Xi Jinping is that high-level Chinese politics, which are always opaque, secretive, and a challenge to figure out, have become even more so. Indeed, there's a kind of irony that even though China, in many respects, is more accessible today than in the Mao years, Xi and other leaders travel, they meet other foreign dignitaries, they even address organizations like the World Economic Forum in Davos, our knowledge of the inner workings at the pinnacle of power in China is arguably less than in Mao's times, and conditions for reporters have continued to deteriorate. In 2019, just before COVID, the Foreign Correspondents Club of China released its annual report in which 82% of the correspondents surveyed said they experienced harassment, interference, or violence while reporting, and 70% said they had interviews that they'd set up canceled due to the actions of Chinese authorities. Access shrank further during the early days of the pandemic, when nearly 20 journalists for the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal were expelled. Beijing justified the expulsions as a response to a decision by the Trump administration to cap the number of staff at 4 state-run Chinese media outlets in the U.S. But the move decimated the U.S. press corps in China. With just a handful of reporters there now, that has largely meant having to cover China from the outside. Ironically, the arc of the story recounted in Assignment China is it's kind of come full circle, because we're back to a sort of modern-day version of the art of China washing that emerged in Hong Kong in the 1950s. The central element still involves plowing through the state-run media, trying to decipher the real meaning behind the rhetoric, jargon, slogans, symbols, obscure historical references, and dubious statistics pumped out by the Communist Party. But today, unlike years past, there are new tools and resources. These include monitoring the Chinese internet, which despite censorship can still provide critical insights. One recent example is this New York Times piece. It collected the obituaries that had been publicly posted online since January 2019 on the websites of the Chinese Academy of Engineering and the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and discovered that while there were usually 3 or 4 obituaries every month, once the Chinese government abandoned its zero COVID policy last December, the number of obituaries shot up dramatically. It was terrific reporting and provided powerful evidence that the government's official death toll didn't match a much grimmer reality. Indeed, there are now a host of new online publications devoted to following the Chinese internet and the Chinese media more broadly, and I'm sure you know most of them. They include, among others, What's on Weibo, run by a Dutch China specialist, which charts what appears on the Chinese version of Twitter. There's Cynicism, run by American China expert Bill Bishop, which offers summaries, analysis, and links to major Chinese media stories. And the Chinese Media Project, which does something similar. There's also commercially available satellite imagery, which was used to uncover the evidence of the camps in Xinjiang, and that's become increasingly important. More recently, reporters use satellite images to document unusually high activity at crematoriums across China. This was a picture taken of a crematorium near Beijing, and if you look on the right-hand side, you see a lot of cars in the parking lot, and you look on the left-hand side and it's almost empty. The difference is that picture was taken on the left in early December. This picture was taken at the end of December, and it's yet another example of the high death toll that the government didn't acknowledge due to its abandonment of the zero COVID policy. Moreover, China's growing international involvement is also providing opportunities for reporters. One recent example was this long Wall Street Journal piece about problems in many high-profile Chinese construction projects that are part of the much-publicized Belt and Road Initiative. The journal reporters talked to people in Peru, Pakistan, Uganda, Angola, and elsewhere. Interestingly, though, although they requested comment from Chinese embassies, companies, and the central government, no one was willing to speak with them. There are countless other similar cases of correspondents trying to get the Chinese perspective but being routinely rebuffed. Another example of how China goes out of its way to make it hard for foreign journalists. Perhaps the most unfortunate consequence of the sharp drop in American and other foreign media access to China is the ability of reporters to go around the country, to talk to people, to witness for themselves what is going on has been severely limited. Being there is the essential foundation for good journalism, and that's become harder and harder to do. In addition, even when travel is possible, reporters also face a populace who, after years of being told by state media that foreign journalists are spies, are often reluctant to talk, if not downright hostile. The upshot is that journalists are less able to convey the richness and complexity and humanity of the world's most populous nation. And I think that's something that is increasingly important to do, especially now at a time of growing tension between China and the United States. So Bill said I could only go for 20 minutes, and even with the technical glitches, I think that's about 20. So let me stop there. Thanks for your attention, and we'll open it up for questions and discussion.
I promised a special surprise, so we have with us John Sudworth and Yvonne Murray of the BBC and RFE, RTE, I can't get that straight, who, after the events described in Mike's book, were persuaded to leave China. So I've given them 2 minutes. He's a TV guy, so I want to give them, if you wish, 2 minutes to describe what happened to you and how did it all go down.
Each have a mic.
Go on up here. You need to be on camera.
Yeah, be on camera, please. You're a TV guy.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you, Mike. It's a really fascinating presentation. I can't wait to read the book. Bill said it would be a surprise presentation. It's as much of a surprise to me as it is to you. But I think it's just a couple of things for me. So we left China.
Excuse me. Your faces are covered with the slide, so if you could sit in the chairs or go in the podium, that would be good, because otherwise we still.
That's not going to work.
I think we got to turn the slide off because your face is. But Bill, you've got images all over your face. Okay. I'm sorry to intervene, but.
Thank you. So I was in China for the best part of 10 years. I started as a correspondent in Shanghai with the BBC, and then moved to Beijing. Yvonne was there with RTE, the Irish national broadcaster. And I think a couple of things that resonate for me with your talk there, Mike, is one, the thought that when I got to China in 2012, just before Xi Jinping became Party General Secretary in that autumn. Looking back, I think what strikes me is that we spent a lot of our time doing what we heard some of the reporters there describe, which is, gazing at skyscrapers. China was still an extraordinary story of rapid development, this emerging middle class. Although we do the story about, the odd dissident, being unable to speak freely and campaigning for whatever they were doing, they were really not, that wasn't news. The news in China was the 2008 Olympics, was this sense that things were heading in that direction. Obviously things began to change, and for me what really, I think in the end, to cut a long story short, hastened my departure was the Xinjiang story. So we did a lot of work on Xinjiang, travelled in and out of Xinjiang regularly, and as you heard described there, really started to rely heavily on remote sensing data, the satellite photos, the documents. And obviously, as we started to deliver new lines on that story, we started to sort of attract every reporter gets a lot of attention as part of the course, but we started to really come in for a lot of pressure to the point where we began to be threatened with legal action. In my foreign ministry meetings, they would say to me, if you keep doing what you're doing, somebody's going to sue you. And I'd say, who's going to sue me? What are you saying? You're going to sue me? No, just sort of saying, keep upsetting the Chinese people, want to sue. And then eventually, things got tougher and tougher until there was a big banner headline in the Global Times saying Xinjiang residents to sue BBC, threats to the foreign ministry podium, and we left. So we weren't expelled, but we felt that the threats had got to a level that with a young family in China, we couldn't tolerate any longer, and it had become almost impossible we couldn't move on the road. The pressure we were we were under. So we left in early 2021, and I think a couple of very brief thoughts for me. I remember in 2012 when I first got to China, I went to hear a talk by Jeremy Goldcorn, who some of you might know, who at the time was doing some sort of social media consultancy. As foreign companies wanted to sort of penetrate this emerging middle class, social media was becoming a huge frontier for selling products, and he was involved in that. So he was an internet sort of expert very early on. And I can remember him saying at that point, he said, if the Chinese Communist Party is still in power in 30 years' time, it'll be because of the internet. If the Chinese Communist Party is thrown out of power, it'll be because of the internet. We just don't know which way that's going to go. And I think what we see from everything that you touched on there, Mike, is that question has been answered for us. I think what has changed, beyond any doubt, is the ability of the Chinese Communist Party to nail Jello to the wall, in Clinton's famous phrase, and use it as a tool of control. That's what's made it very, very much harder, I think, for Chinese people and for the people trying to tell China's story. But there are glimmers of hope, and I think, in the sort of journalism I was able to do in a giant digital state, it cannot help but leave breadcrumbs of evidence, and it is through that I think we are still able to hold out some hope that we can continue telling the truth about what is happening in China.
Thank you.
Can you just turn the projector off so people can...
Yeah.
John. They had to leave within, 24 hours after you made the decision to leave? How long was it?
So once we decided to go, we were on the plane within just a little more than 24 hours. Followed to the airport by we had state security outside the house. Followed through the departure hall, tailed to the airport. So we were gone very quickly when we decided to.
That's like the way it was.
Yeah.
So Mike, we've been involved in this for a long time. The U.S. media, myself included, believe that China should be allowed to join the WTO, that they would become a responsible stakeholder in the international order that we had helped establish. We believe in the peaceful evolution of the Chinese political system. So now the tone has obviously shifted. So do you feel that it's a justified shift, that the American media is reflecting the reality, or has it become too shrill?
Well, I think, if you go back, we chronicled China's joining the WTO. We chronicled what appeared to be steps that might lead to China becoming a responsible stakeholder. And it was Robert Zoellick who invented the phrase. I don't think we were advocating it, we were trying to chronicle it. And that, that China has changed. I think it's not so much that the press got it. There are lots of things the press got wrong, and it's certainly something we can talk about. But China has changed. I mean, the China that I lived through in the late 80s, and then after it began to ease up again, early 90s, following the repression 2-3 years around Tiananmen, it really was changing. I mean, we were not making up this stuff about a more open society. And it was reflected in reporting that became much easier. It was always a headache, but it was much easier to do. You could go around more readily. It wasn't that hard to talk to people. There were obviously lines that if you crossed, you would get into trouble. But China has really changed. And
under Xi Jinping?
I think some of it was beginning before Xi Jinping. And I think the Communist Party was worried that the level of corruption and sort of rot in the system really could present kind of a mortal threat. And they kind of hired Xi to tighten things up. Whether the elders who anointed him anticipated he was going to do what he did, who knows? Because as I say, we really don't know.
I remember Henry Paulson running around saying that Xi Jinping was going to be a great reformer after he conducted his corruption campaign.
Oh, I went online. I found a whole bunch of headlines in the New York, opinion pieces in the New York Times and the South China Morning Post, Is she the great reformer? Well, oops, we got that one wrong. But you know, Chinese got it wrong too. There's an anecdote in Simon China when she put in the change to the Constitution that allowed himself to essentially rule indefinitely. Jane Perlez of the New York Times, who told me about, she called this Chinese academic that she was in regular contact with, who was sort of nationalist-ish and largely sympathetic to Xi on many levels, and she said, what do you make of this? And she said he was like, well, I can't say anything, I'm just too shocked. So I think it took people in the Chinese system by surprise. It's not like we missed something, we collectively, the press, missed something that was glaringly obvious that was evident in China. And it's a function of the fact that we just don't know very much about Xi. And we don't know very much about the elite, really elite level politics. And so there's endless speculation. You know, maybe in a dozen years you'll find out more. I mean, one of the things that was very interesting to me in researching the book is I went back and I watched a lot of the coverage, and it's fun to go back and see what people were writing in the 50s and 60s. But what's striking to me is, on balance, I would say the American press got it right on the broad brush strokes more often than they got it wrong. They got plenty wrong and lots of details wrong. But the broad outlines of the dynamics of the power struggle and all that, they basically got more right than wrong.
So you don't think the American media, the Western media, fundamentally misread who Xi Jinping was? It just wasn't clear who he was.
There's always, we just didn't know, so you project on it what you think, okay, he worked in one of the provincial areas, and his father was a quasi-reformist guy during the early days of reform, so you grab it, you look for the crumbs or graft at straws or whatever, and you try and construct the narrative because you've got to follow your story. But we didn't really know, and he obviously played his cards. I think a lot of the high-level people he purged didn't really know either.
So the Chinese talk about the global discourse. They're masters of information and propaganda. And they allege that the Western media is engaged in a campaign against the Communist Party by concentrating on things we think are wrong. We think it's wrong that the Uyghurs are being essentially assimilated. We think it's wrong what they did in Hong Kong, wiping out democracy, violating their agreement. We think it's wrong that the Chinese are supporting Moscow in the war in Ukraine. Are we, the Western media, projecting values we shouldn't be projecting, or are we doing our job?
Well, I think that if they read this book, they'll have a much better sense of how journalism actually works. There's an old joke that the two things you don't want to see the inside of are a sausage factory and a newsroom, and for the same reason. But American Western journalism, at its finest, has certain values that come with the craft of journalism. It's to hold the powerful accountable, to be a voice for the voiceless, to shed a light in dark places that powerful interests may not necessarily want exposed, and that's part of the democracy, giving people the information so that they can make up their own minds and behave accordingly. That's what, in a democracy, ideally, the media does. There are plenty of examples in the States and in Britain and elsewhere of how that's not always true in practice, and there are lots of issues about the media. But that is sort of where we come from. And so you go to China, you're going to do the same thing. And partly it's also the definition of what's news. I flew from Taiwan to San Francisco last week and my plane landed. It wasn't in the news, but if the plane had landed in the Bay and we all died, it would have been news. It's just the way it works. And that's sort of what journalists do. I think anybody who's done this work will realize the notion of a campaign is nonsense. You get up in the morning as the CNN correspondent or the RTE correspondent, the BBC correspondent, and it's like, oh, they want a story tonight. Oh God, we got 7 hours to do it. Where are we going to get the video? Is there somebody we can get a soundbite for? Is the internet working to do a feed? And people today are lucky that it's the internet. When I did it, you had to drive to the TV station in the middle of the night and convince your editors to pay $2,000 for a satellite feed. And so all of these things, and before that, people in the book talk about going to the Dianbao Dalo, the telegraph office in Beijing, and typing stuff out on a telex machine. When I do talks, I often ask people, have you ever seen or heard of a telex machine? I mean, in this room, I guess a lot of people have. But you'd be amazed how many people don't even know what a telex machine is. It's like people who never use a typewriter. So it's the process that really shapes what goes into it. And the notion that there's some master plan is just nonsense. That doesn't mean that editors in New York or Washington or London, when they write the headlines or decide if the story is the lead or the end of the broadcast or whatever, aren't affected by the discourse, the daily discourse of what's going on. And what's going on in Washington now, for example, is obviously shaping the tone. But for the people in the field, and that's really what China is about, I don't think that really applies.
You think it's going to get worse? Do you think the Chinese are going to ratchet up pressure on the Western media even further?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's interesting. They haven't expelled everybody. In the last year, they have let in a few people. I think, like the New York Times, I think has 2 people now, whereas for a while it only had 1. None of the people who were expelled have been allowed back in or allowed to go to Hong Kong. But they have allowed a few new people in. You know, it's kind of a paradox. I mean, I think on the one hand, the Chinese leadership, they want to see the international order reflect what they see as China's legitimate standing as this great power. On the other hand, they also sort of crave respect and legitimacy from the existing order and institutions. So if you're a serious superpower, you need to have a New York Times correspondent there. Otherwise, you're not a serious superpower. So they want it, but they want to control it. And it doesn't cost them very much to have 1 or 2 people there because the dynamic, the problems they create on the ground, the difficulties of getting around, are such that they can sort of live with it. But the treatment of the press also is a barometer of the relationship, and if the relationship is going down, it's going to get harder for the press. So there's no question.
It's amazing what Paul Mazur has been able to do from Seoul and Chris Buckley from Sydney.
Chris is now in Taipei, actually.
Oh, really?
Which is the new center of China watching.
New old center.
The new old center of China watching. I'm there too. So.
Well, this is a related question. Could it reach the situation that we had before 1979, and that there is no Western media, no American media on what you just said?
I don't think so. I think the Chinese need to be able to say, what do you mean we're giving them trouble? There's a Washington Post correspondent, there's a New York Times correspondent, there are 3 Wall Street Journal correspondents. Bloomberg is reporting our flourishing stock markets. So they want that and they need that, and they've created a control mechanism where they can have it without generally the press creating the kind of problems, because it's no longer possible to do the things that were possible before. For example, in Assignment China, Kathy Chen, who was a Wall Street Journal reporter, talks about wanting to do a story on the great migration of people from the countryside to work in the big joint venture factories. So she went out to Sichuan and she got on a bus with these 5 young girls who were leaving their villages for the first time and going to Guangdong to work in a Mattel doll factory. And it was just her, there was no minders, just sat on this bus for 5 days and talked to these young women, and then she sneaked into their dormitory in Dongguan because she looked like them. She got a fantastic piece. That would effectively be almost impossible to do today. So the government can have its cake and eat it too, if I'm not sure if that's the right metaphor. But it's simple.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I will take questions from the floor, or I'll keep talking forever if you wish. So imagine what would happen if Chris Buckley had not been in Wuhan, Dave Kong, and others. Yeah. We might never have known anything about where COVID came from. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the on-the-ground presence that allows us to have some chance of understanding the dynamics internally. So if in fact more and more reportings have to be done outside via satellites, it may become even more mysterious what's actually happening inside China.
I think it's very worrisome because not being able to put your pulse on the society in the way that comes from just traveling around, looking at things, talking to people, means that we don't really have a sense of the dynamic in society. And because there isn't that kind of reporting, what does get in the news is wolf warrior diplomacy and TikTok hearings and war over Taiwan. And that's probably because it's legitimate news. I mean, it's happening, got to be reported. But it makes the sort of depiction of China into the sort of one-dimensional bad guy. Whereas the reality is it's a living, breathing society of 1.3 billion individuals who have their own hopes and dreams and successes and failures and aspirations, and whose feelings and activities will be important in shaping the future of China. And to not have a sense of that, I mean, we don't really know whether the bulk of the Chinese people like the direction it's going now or are unhappy. We can sort of guess that the lockdowns in Shanghai may have antagonized the urban middle class who were previously quite happy to go along because, as long as it did to the waiters but not to the urban middle class, that was fine. Will that have political consequences? Maybe, possibly. Do we have any sense of that because we're able to get around and talk to people? Not really. So we're kind of, operating in a void, which I think is dangerous on policy level and a disservice to consumers of news. And ironically, it hurts China too, because if the Chinese don't like the depiction of China as the evil empire 2.0, not allowing journalists to show that it's a living, breathing society full of ordinary human beings who don't spend all their time spouting wolf warrior slogans hurts them too. But I think they feel, well, we can use social media and our own outlets to tell our story. We don't need them.
Yes, Alan Frank.
Mike, what's your assessment of the actual effect on U.S. relations with China by Trump's 4 years in office?
I think it was an absolutely profound shift, although it wasn't initiated by Trump. I think you can date the sort of beginnings of this shift to the Obama period. I think there was a kind of somewhat unrealistic notion when Obama took office they were going to have this great cooperative relationship with China. If you read some of the stuff that his main Asia guy, Jeff Bader, wrote, that's what he talked about. But after the financial crisis, as I mentioned, I think the Chinese thought the Americans are downward slope. And the first telltale sign of that came when Obama made his trip to China in 2009. And there's a section in the book where the reporters who were covering that trip talked about how the Chinese went out of their way. Were you in China then? No. Went out of their way to humiliate him. They wouldn't let him do a live press conference. They packed. They wouldn't let him speak where he wanted to speak. They treated him like, oh, he's this young whippersnapper, and what does he know? And he's just a freshman, and so on. And there was this kind of contempt, and I think that resonated. And it's not a coincidence that after that, you saw the beginning of the so-called pivot to Asia and this more critical perception of China, although there really was an attempt still to try and make it work. But then, Trump came in and for all sorts of muddled, reasons did what he did. But the people around him who worked on China were very tough-minded, like Matt Pottinger, who some of you may know, I knew him when he was a Wall Street Journal correspondent in Beijing. And so I think they really shifted gears. But it's not unilateral, and some of the forces that are at work are China's own behavior. Because the Chinese, started building these man-made islands in the South China Sea with military use, and the Chinese were being very provocative around the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands with Japan. The Chinese were pushing it already. I think the way Trump did it, like everything else Trump did, was clumsy and crude and stupid and counterproductive and alienating allies when you need allies. And I think Biden has done a much shrewder job. If you're going to counter China, you want to have the Japanese and the South Koreans and the others be on good terms and not be annoyed at you because you're gratuitously offending them. Trump
calling the country shitholes.
Yes, exactly. But it was an important shift. But it wasn't, I mean, in Trump's case, it wasn't done out of principle because he has no principles. But the people around him were much more hard-nosed about China. But they were also responding to a shift in China's behavior. It wasn't that benign China was just happily trundling along and Trump came in and said, oh, we're going to thump them.
Please identify yourself and ask a question.
Thank you. My name is Yan Aixi. I'm a geopolitical analyst at Gamco Dragonomics. So listening to the narrative and looking at the slide that spans decades, I was struck by two contrasts. One is that the Chinese people's fashion has changed over time, but the fashion of Royal Mail correspondents has not changed. The second contrast, which is the question, is it seems the paradox of when China was actually poorer, weaker, when it was just opening up to the world, Chinese leaders seem to be more confident. They had this long-form, freewheeling interviews. Deng Xiaoping had that with Michael Wallace, and Jiang Zemin, Zhu Rongji had this freewheeling.
Jiang Zemin had it with me.
Right, freewheeling press conferences. But when China became richer and more integrated with the world, the Chinese leaders climbed up. They closed themselves and never made themselves available to reporters. I could not recall anything that Wen Jiabao or Hu Jintao did.
Wen Jiabao did one thing with Christian Amanpour, but you're absolutely right, less and less and less.
Right, so why is that a case?
Ask them, I don't know. I don't know, but whether it's partly we're more successful, we don't need them. I think that's part of it. And also, I mean, in more recent years, as the country has gotten more internally repressive, what are these people to ask obnoxious questions? We don't have to deal with that kind of nonsense. We're the leader of China, so screw them. But I found that you can find online, there's a YouTube 15-minute clip of Edgar Snow talking to Zhou Enlai in like 1964. And it's fascinating, both to hear what Zhou Enlai was like, but also the notion that Jiang Zemin would sit down, even if there was a foreign interlocutor with whom for whom he had as much trust and confidence as Mao and Zhou Enlai had in Edgar Snow. It's inconceivable that he would do that because he's just too elevated. They don't do that anymore.
I think one turning point may have been the Bloomberg and New York Times reports about the wealth of Premier Wen and the other Chinese official, that the Chinese were shocked that the Americans' media could penetrate in that way.
Figure it out, yeah.
I think that was another seminal moment. Yes.
Anakash, I'm a writer and editor based in China until just last winter. I was wondering if we could reverse this and you could tell us about your encounters or knowledge of Chinese correspondents in America and the West and how that has changed and expanded or contracted in the last decades.
To be honest, I can't really. I mean, I stopped being a CNN correspondent in 2006, and I haven't lived in the States in years, so I've had almost no dealings with them. So maybe someone else has had more recent dealings. I would assume that as the constraints on the media in China tighten, that shapes what they can and cannot say, but I haven't had any personal interactions. So, Michael.
So may we identify you as one of the Michaels?
If you wish, yes. I'd like to just be myself. Michael Cogwick, currently a senior advisor for Asia with the International Crisis Group. When I was a diplomat in China, one of the things that I struggled to try to convey in diplomatic reporting was the atmosphere around when you were talking particularly, not to average Chinese, but to government officials or anything that the party state and the government and the security organs touched, the degree to which there was a certain sense of, or some sense of fear or authoritarianism or oppression or control, the nervousness in your interlocutor, for example, the fact that when you went to interview somebody or talk to somebody, there would often be someone else sitting with them to keep an eye on things like that. How did you and your colleagues over the years observe, how did that sort of atmosphere change and evolve over time, and how did you deal with the challenge of conveying back to a reader who's probably never been to China, how it's different, how much more difficult it was to actually have that kind of conversation in China over the years than it would be in a Western context. How do you get that across?
It's a really interesting question. As a TV reporter, it would have been really hard to do that because you just see what you shot on screen, and you don't have the luxury of writing 5 paragraphs of context and so on. Yeah, I mean, sometimes people were very open. Sometimes people really had to be coaxed. I was there during a period. I mean, where when I got there in '87, and it was a relatively upbeat time in China. And '88, I think, was the most open year intellectually, in some respects, in the whole history of the People's Republic. So it was there were lots of interesting people who were eager and willing to talk. There was the U.S. and China were friends. There wasn't this kind of edge. There were plenty of situations where we weren't allowed to go somewhere. They wanted all the questions in advance. Getting people on camera was always a challenge. And then you had Tiananmen. You had about 18 months when you really couldn't do anything. You couldn't get permission to go anywhere. You just kind of spinning.
Foreign ministry would say, "Butai come again."
Yeah. But then then it began to open up, and I remember hearing from like business people in Guangdong and in Shanghai, you guys are missing something by being fixated on human rights and whether or not the U.S. is going to renew most favored nation status, because that's not what's going on down here. And I did this trip, and I did a series called The Tale of Two Chinas in '92. And once that kicked in, as long as you framed what you were going to do as we want to look at, the economic growth, the access was pretty good. And I think throughout the 90s, in terms of that aspect of the story, it was okay. But I mean, David Barbosa told me at one point that Chinese companies, when he went in there as a business correspondent in the early 2000s, were more accessible than getting an American multinational to tell you what you're doing in China. Next to impossible. Chinese companies, oh yes, New York Times. So it's kind of mixed and paradoxical. And as journalists, we almost never had the access at the level where what you were talking about. I mean, maybe I saw John Pomfret in San Francisco, and he said he would periodically have lunch with Cui Tiankai, who later was the ambassador here. I never got that, but it was all off the record. It was sort of like what you do in Washington, but I never got that, and so for us, it wasn't from the camera. It didn't really help.
So we have room for another half an hour. I see 2 questions, and then after we end the discussion, there'll be more beverages consumed, more socializing, connecting, I hope.
And more books sold.
More books sold. So this is the cash bar. The bar out there is a credit card bar. So if you want to spend cash, that's the place. The credit cards are out there. So yes, what were those 2 questions? Yes. Please identify yourself and ask a question.
Hi, I'm Helen Rose, aspiring China watcher, and throughout your presentation you talk a lot about the differences in sort of Western correspondence experiences. I was curious if you had any insights into the experiences of quote-unquote fixers or Chinese citizen journalists and their experiences working with the Western media in China and how that has evolved as they also face increasing repression from the Chinese government.
Yeah, for those who didn't hear, the question was about the Chinese assistants or fixers who work with foreign journalists. I say in the introduction to the book that I made a conscious decision not to include them in the book, simply because asking them questions would put them in their position is so sensitive. Either they would have to make stuff up or lie or be evasive. If they were straightforward about it, they would get into trouble. They were just too sensitive. So I didn't include them in the book, but there's not a single correspondent who's been based in China who will not acknowledge the crucial importance of your fixer and your interpreter. And over time, the system for using and hiring those people evolved. When I was there, they just gave you got whoever you got from the DSP, from the Diplomatic Service Bureau, and you were stuck with them. And sometimes they were good folks and they kind of got it, and sometimes they couldn't be bothered and there was nothing you could do about it. That parenthetically is why, for those of you who may know the name of Jaime Floracruz, Jimmy Floracruz, Cheeto Romano, Eric Bacalunao, there were these Filipino, they were left-wing students who went to China in 1971 on a friendship tour and discovered that they were on a hit list ordered by President Ferdinand Marcos. And they basically stayed thinking it would be 6 months, and it stayed till Marcos was overthrown, 15 years. And they all went to Chinese universities, became fluent in Chinese. And then when the Americans opened their news bureaus, they suddenly were sought after because they had the Chinese language skills and they knew their way around the country, but they weren't locked into all of the pressures and the baggage that your average Chinese translator. And so they Eric ended up as bureau chief of NBC, Cheeto ended up as bureau chief of ABC, and then Philippine ambassador to China. Sadly died last year. Jimmy ended up as CNN bureau chief, and now he's the ambassador in Beijing. I just sent him a copy of the book. But their value was partly a reflection of the fact that you didn't get this kind of help. But as time went on, it became easier to hire people, and it was one of these things where if you found somebody who was really keen, and you go to the DSB and say, put them in your system, and they would be generally cooperative. So you had an evolution towards people who were much more journalistically minded and saw themselves as journalists. Were very helpful. I don't know what your experience, John and Ron.
Yeah, I mean, we could recruit openly. They were still employed through the DSB. And I think alongside everything we've discussed tonight, it's a really important question. I think the position that those Chinese nationals are in is increasingly difficult. And speaking personally and across the whole industry, they are some of the bravest, most brilliant and inspiring people I've ever met.
And they come under tremendous pressure. Their families get told your son or daughter is a traitor, they're working for foreigners. There have been any number of cases where people have been intimidated into leaving. Some who have been hired full-time, like Hayes Pham of Bloomberg News, was imprisoned. So it's very tough, but they are, even if journalists have good Chinese, they are eyes and ears into a society in a way that people who look like us can never have.
One last question is over here. No? Jan Alexander?
Hi, I'm Jan Alexander. I've been a business writer who's written about China for a long time. And I mean, the story until just a few years ago, when you talked about China, was often China trying to be a dominant power when it came to technology, but beyond surveillance technology, things like smart cars and all kinds of there was a Made in China 2025 campaign that was designed to have all kinds of manufacturing, high-tech manufacturing coming out of China that would, to some extent, obliterate their need for all of this Western involvement in their economy, all this Western investment, and they would, in some cases, be selling more of an importer to the West and be just more of a dominant economic high-tech power in that sense. Is that, I mean, you're hearing less about that in the media, mostly about when you hear about Chinese technology, it's surveillance technology. But is that still a story that is worth looking at, just for the purpose of looking at the extent to which China is going to use its manufacturing and technological and economic power to try to overtake overtake the United States to
dominate the world.
target on it as a world superpower.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely an important story, and it becomes more important in the sense how they respond to the pressure from the Americans and other countries that are denying certain kinds of technology and what they're going to do. So yeah, it is important. I don't know. I mean, I haven't been in China in a number of years, and I'm not sort of doing daily journalism. So
Would you go to China? Would you go?
I'm not so sure it would.
Where do you think the Hunter Biden thing's going
I don't have the slightest idea.
Do that over dinner. We're done for now. Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Thanks very much.